This is a song about living with someone who's in a bad place and trying to be there for them, but also keep yourself happy, I guess. It's called Dark Cloud. There is a dark cloud, and I the only one in her atmosphere. She keeps me warm, yes, she keeps me near in the dead of night. There is a dark cloud, and when it rains I get drenched from head to toe. She doesn't see, no, she never knows I'm not alright. But there is a dark cloud. Oh. Piece of my own space. I would always opt for the sun on my face. I don't wanna be a dark cloud. There is a dark cloud, and so oblivious to her world beneath, to the droplets perched on the vines and leaves in quiet defeat. But there is a dark cloud, and there is no shelter from her rain. Still I follow through misty wet terrain underneath my feet. And all I ever asked for was a piece of my own space. I would always opt for the sun on my face. I don't wanna be a dark there is a dark cloud, and my father is the waterfalls, and I haven't heard from him at all in quite some time. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Where to begin? And it is with no irony that I am here opposite Tower Street, but I'm just going to probably start off with a sentence some of you will know, and it is a moo cow came down the road. It is the opening line of James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, and probably one of the first books I ever took from my parents' library. I am a child of from the country. I grew up in what would be described as a perfect town. I grew up in a military town. It was the Curragh Camp, and it had roads wide enough for tanks and soldiers to move around. It was never extended. It had no planning issues. It was designed for one purpose, and it had schools, hospitals, and horses even. It was a perfect world, and I lived in a part of that town on the edges in a house for internment of German prisoners of war who, if they landed in Ireland, were put in these houses. So there were bizarre kind of places to grow up. There were kind of inflated houses made very quickly of tin, so they were poorly insulated, but they were fantastic places if you were a child. Like, your imagination was vastly stimulated by this experience, because they had to have things like larders that were big enough to feed 12 grown men. They had to have living rooms big enough for everybody to sit down, and they had formal things like dining rooms and odd things, but it was in a shed, basically. So this was where I grew up, and I loved it. You know, it was it just was, your mind could go anywhere as a child. My parents, though, had to move out eventually. We'd 8 or 9 years there, and we really had to get our own home. Like most people in the army, you couldn't live there for free forever, although it was a nice idea. So my father, who was a very kind of gregarious, big personality, would come home with these sets of drawings of the house, his idealized house that he was going to live in. And oddly enough, it was a bungalow, which is not unusual in Ireland. And there was no mention of the word architect. It was just a set of drawings. But I'd never realised that drawings and a building went together. And he would unfurl these at night, and we would look and go through them all. And it was really, really interesting. And there was the room. And there was a big obsession in the 70s with a thing called the view. People didn't talk about light. They talked about the view. So my father took the drawings out to Kildare, to the edges, and he said, he positioned the house, because planning was a loosey-goosey thing. You kind of took the plans and you said, we're going to put the house there. And he orientated the house towards the view, which meant the entire rest of the house was plunged into darkness. And nothing grew. And so there was a thing called a rockery, which was big in the 70s and 80s as well. No plants grew in this rockery. The veranda, nobody went out into because there was moss on it. But we had this one thing where we'd go out and see the view, which was over the kitchen sink, which was an incredibly important place for the woman of the house, as she was watching, and not a television, the view. But it was beautiful, and the Midlands unfurled in front of us. But there was another prevalent thing. There was no such thing as furniture shopping as such. There was no IKEA, there was no flat pack notion, there was certainly no upcycling. And what the parents did of a Sunday, and most people did in those days, they went to things called auction rooms. And in an auction room, you would find what was emptying out of the country at the time were these old wardrobes and pieces of furniture from the old great houses. They were a lot of people were leaving, a lot of the West Brit population were leaving Ireland, so all the houses were getting stripped of fireplaces, all sorts of things. And if you were lucky enough, you were buying them, as my parents were. They would go around, we would all run out into the auction rooms. They were fantastic places. So huge wardrobes, there was no issue of it, having to be fixed to the back of a wall, because they were so heavy and so they were built for these big, huge houses. So we had quite a stock of furniture accumulated in the old prisoner's house that we'd been living in. So moving day came to go to the bungalow, and the furniture was left on the avenue because we couldn't fit it into the house. So I suddenly quickly realised that this was a bad move. All that furniture that I had spent years playing in, we couldn't fit it in. It was stuck outside because it was too tall, that the new bungalow was in actual fact not all that it was cracked up to be, and that we had made a very big mistake. That we were no longer going to go and live in the perfect town, and we were suddenly out of this extraordinary house. But it was something I kept in my head. I remember thinking, right, don't believe everything you read, and don't look at every drawing and everything that anybody ever tells you that's going to be better with a certain amount of cynicism. And it stayed with me, but it also prickled in me kind of a nascent architecture, if you know what I mean. I knew there was no architect involved, but I knew drawings had been involved, and somewhere down the line somebody had drawn this house, which was of kind of much poorer quality than this stupid military built shed. With that, and many years later, I was also subject to what was known as you had an aptitude test, because we were all that generation whose parents didn't go to college. So your parents were very motivated, they were all coming out of this into this new Ireland, and they wanted the best for you. So we were all put in the car, driven up to Dublin, and introduced to a psychologist who went through all our aptitudes and said, good doctor, engineer, and they said architect for me. And I was like, what is that? I did not know what an architect was. I couldn't even spell the word, but they said she'd make a really good architect and psychiatrist for some reason. So that was the equivalent of 600 points, which I wasn't going to get, but I did. I had been wandering around the Midlands for years, photographing old houses. I'd had an interest in architecture since we'd moved from the Curragh camp. So I knew there was something in me that was interested in this. So anyway, I was dispatched to DIT to Bolton Street and into architecture school. And it was not a place that, it wasn't like college now. It was a full-on kind of technical college. And it was a dry university, which means there was no beer. It was, it was all about the learning. And my mother also was very anxious about sending up her 17-year-old girl. So she did a thing which was quite an achievement. And you know the way you'd think 17 escaped the city from the bungalow in the country. No, my mother managed to find nuns for me to go to. And I was like, this can't be, it could not have happened. She did. She found a hostel. And a hostel is the wrong word because it's a holy faith hostel. And in actual fact, it was actually a place, a Magdalen laundry, to all intensive purposes, on Henrietta Street, right across from DIT and Bolton Street. Now, it was also probably one of the most beautiful streets in Dublin and one of the most important historical streets in Dublin. It has the King's Inns at the back, but this, I won't sugarcoat it. It was grim enough because the women there at night cried. There was old women crying at night, so that never left me. And years later, I went on to do a study of the Magdalen laundries, mapped them, recorded them, and painted them just to remember some of the women I knew from there. But they weren't expecting us. And we were over in college and I met a girl from Naas. Now Naas, she was a punk. And in the day, that meant girl punks were rare enough now. So she put the hair down, waxed it down, and she managed to get into the hostel with me as well. So that was the beginning of the end for the nuns as well, because they were expecting the nice girls from the architecture school, they would keep up on the top dorm, and instead they got a new generation of women as well. So they would say, if you're not in by 9 o'clock this evening, ladies, you will be locked out. And we went, fine. We weren't frightened of town. We had friends, so we would stay in other people's apartments and bedsits and sleep on the floor, which was a hideous experience. I can add to that, attest to that. Sleeping on floors is not to be recommended. But I suppose it's better than sleeping in the hostel. But I did get an appreciation for that sense of what Dublin was. I was still living in one of the most bizarre streets in Dublin. There was an architect at one point building a boat in one of the Georgian houses, and he would regularly trail over first-year students and say, come along, this is perfectly proportioned for boat building, but that's how big they were. It was an ordinary thing for all of us, and we had access to that kind of space, which is a hugely important thing about the city at the moment, access to space. And that's really ultimately what I'm here to talk to you about, is the access for young people and older people, and you lot, for cheap space. So anyway, first year you had to pay for college. College was expensive. There was no free college. So you went off, and I went to London, and I got a job surveying heritage properties. With that, I would go out with my tape measure, and we all pretended we were 3 years on as well. You were first year, and you'd say, I have a diploma in architecture. And that was the kind of behaviour that was acceptable among Irish students at the time. So my job was measuring heritage buildings, and you got paid by the room, which sounds like a great thing, except heritage properties are huge. So one room could take you a day. So you get it was badly paid, to say the least. And at one point, I was measuring somebody's apartment in Sloane Square or something like that. And I remember a living room had measured 16 metres. And I remember coming back and looking at it thinking, no way it could have measured 16 metres. Because we were a poor nation. The concept of an apartment having 16 metres, I just thought I'd made a mistake. So I took not a 0 away, I took a 1 away, and left it just at 6 metres. And I didn't get paid because, in fact, it was 16 metres long. But I had a catalogue as a result of this work in the back of my head of thousands, or well, not thousands, I exaggerate, but hundreds of kind of properties in London, houses in London, maisonettes in London, and also of the way they lived, like these rich Londoners, how they lived. They lived completely differently to us. They went to Wimbledon, they were, their students hung out. It was just a different type of generation. And then went home, kind of back up to Bolton Street, and the following year then, the punk from Naas was going somewhere else, and the rest of us were going to Paris. So I was out of the hostel at that stage and grimly looking. It was extremely difficult to get accommodation for students then and we will get on to student accommodation. Extremely difficult to get a house to live in, or let alone a bedsit in Dublin. So you would walk around for hours and hours and weeks to try and eventually get one. But we ended up that summer, we went off to Paris. Now I went with the pre-Raphaelites to Paris, which was a very bad idea. You know, you go to college and there's some of the girls were, you know, they weren't eating, they looked extremely elegant and they were beautiful. And I was their dumpy friend that went along with them. And the problem was, one of them managed to get me a job in an office where she had been employed because she was so beautiful. And she had said, "Can you get a job for my friend?" And they were like, "Oh, sure," thinking they was going to get another kind of Celtic Twilight person who sang like Anya. And then I snuck in. But he didn't realise I spoke French. So he would talk at length on the phone about this odd little Irish girl. And I was like, bastard. But it was in the back of my head. I kept thinking, French people. But I did learn something from the French. They're obsessive about beauty, life, aesthetics. So again, back to Dublin, in the back of my head thinking, I want to be French. Why can't I be French? I want to be beautiful. I want to be elegant. But I also went back kind of strolling up through Moore Street, and Parnell Street had just disappeared. They had just taken down an entire section of Parnell Street while I was away. And I thought, there was a street here. I'm pretty sure there was a street here. There's no longer a street here. And you kind of don't think anything of it. It's a bit like the bungalow and the drawings. You think everybody knows what they're doing. Everybody's on the same page here. But they had taken an entire street away. And anyway, we went back to college. And after a while, Frank MacDonald was beginning to write in the Irish Times, and I was aware that things were disappearing, like the civic offices. Despite thousands of people on the streets, they were still going to build the civic offices. It was happening. So I kind of thought, I'm going to try and do something, because I was very, very, very quiet in college. So I just put a little sign up on a notice board and said, anybody interested in saving Dublin, if you'd like to come to Studio J17. And very few people turned up. There was about 3 of us. And one of the studio lecturers was looking at my shoulder, kind of reading it out, and he goes, "This is an architecture course. This is a course about building. This is, if you want, you will fail if you're going to do conservation here." And I remember thinking, it's not a good idea to do this. But I went off and did it anyway. And it was coming to the end of the summer, so there was very few people around. And I thought, I have very few people in the room interested in this. So I did what most people did. I went home, raided the linen cupboard, took a big sheet out of my mother's stock of sheets, and decided I would sew an enormous banner and saying, "Students against the destruction of Dublin." And then I met a fella on the train who, Simon O'Driscoll, he's a really famous furniture designer in Ireland now. So he was a friend of mine. I said, "I'm going to do a protest." And he said, "Okay, so." So we went and met 2 or 3, there was about 5 of us, but we sat in Mount Street. Does anybody know where not Mount Street, sorry. It's where the National Gallery of Ireland is. Lower Dawson Street. And you'll notice I was very interested in this site because part of it is Joyce's pharmacy is there. So I thought, I don't think we should knock a few. That's a good part of Dublin. That's in Joyce's Ulysses. So I always go back to Joyce or Beckett, and I keep thinking, I don't know. So we sat in this building, and somebody happened to take a photograph, and it was not knocked down. So the National Gallery said, maybe we won't knock those buildings down. And you'll see them now in Friends of the Gallery. If you're ever in the National Gallery, they're the 2 buildings that we didn't knock down. So there was a sense of success because all of the movements had failed. All of the movements to stop Dublin getting destroyed had failed. So part of the linking in of this was we would use art. We would use innovative tactics to bulk up the numbers. So we would hang wreaths out of buildings. In the middle of the night, we wrapped Halfpenny Bridge. There was a lot of talk about Christo at the time. He was this installation artist, and it did work. We got photographs in the paper. Now, we did a little bit of traffic disruption because at one point there was talk about removing Bachelor's Walk. And just to rest in your head that somebody somewhere thought it was a good idea to remove a section of the quays. A whole streetscape to be removed. And there was no other logic other than it made building more efficient. likewise Eccles Street. And Eccles Street was a really odd one because it was another piece of Joyce's landscape. And you thought, really, I'm not convinced about that going. Like, that's Eccles Street. Like, what's the logic there? So we did a little sit-in, and Eccles Street was saved. And it was at that point, it was like a tipping point for Dublin, where suddenly people stopped thinking about destroying it. And they thought about the integration of architecture and what it meant, you know, the importance of streetscape and the importance of all these little elements. And Temple Bar happened, which, you know, it's funny, but Temple Bar was going to be a bus depot, and it stopped as well. So it was all very, I still failed, by the way, in case anybody is interested. The third year ahead failed me gloriously. And that was the difficulty. I still was very much an architect. I was still very interested in innovative practice. I just didn't want the city destroyed. So, but once that was done, I kind of moved away from the conservation movement, still very interested in heritage buildings, went through college, and I did very well. I ended up with a first-class honours, which was a surprise to everybody involved, including me. But it was the French and the Italians, in fairness, who said I was doing insertions into old buildings. I was very fond of a couple of lads, Co-op Himmelblau, which were Berlin architects who were doing insertions, modern insertions into buildings. So you could only get past architecture a certain amount of new building done. So I had to measure out 32 metres of linear buildings as well to pass. But the French and the Italians reckoned you'll have to give her a first. So there was a lot of contention and politics around involved in that. But somewhere at the back of my head, I thought, I'm not wrong about the city stuff. There's some part of this that's really important, even though everybody's saying, you know, forget heritage or forget conservation. But I was also very interested in design, and I was also a young person. So we built a very big, strong practice. We designed nightclubs. We had great fun. We moved things. We designed housing, and a successful practice happened, and it kept happening. And we were part of this kind of sea change in Dublin, where young people were staying, and there was lots of money in the capital. But it got tiring, and it got hard because the Celtic Tiger was there, and you couldn't talk to people about being necessarily modest about money then. Then it went all the way over the other end, and there was loads of money kind of going on. So I took a break and thought, you know what it is now? I'm going to grow vegetables, and I moved into painting buildings and drawing buildings because I moved to the north side of the city, and I said I'd like to grow raspberry plants. I don't know why, but I thought I want to grow a plant to eat. I had this notion of making jam, and I suppose just to taking time, because conservation was bedded and wedded and institutionalized at this stage. There was nobody required to do anything or to say anything. I thought they were all looking after that. That was grand. The city was grand, and they didn't need annoying people speaking up like me, because they, you know, you were that voice in the room where they were going, oh God, I wish she'd shut up. So I was busy having fun in architecture as well. But so I moved to painting because as I was on the north side of the city, I noticed that it was not that well maintained. The north side of the city was still slightly falling down. So I thought, Jesus, this isn't good. So I got really into that and drawing tenement buildings and recording tenement buildings. And I had a couple of exhibitions, and they went well, and people would say, we're interested in saving this building. Will you do an exhibition? I said, fine. So I went around painting the buildings. But I wasn't being heard, because as I was watching it, I was watching huge tranches of what I'm particularly interested in small businesses, things like North Frederick Street locksmith, or the recent demise of Knobs and Knockers. I quite like small things. And I think, why do I like small things? I don't know. But I'm aware that I feel like that the way I felt like about the city. So I was going, but nobody was listening to me, and they were also doing that thing of, oh, here's your one again. So I thought, okay, I have to, and the exhibitions weren't carrying the same weight with the movement of the destruction of the city again. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to go back to television. I'm going to have to go back to work. And I did go back to sort of raise my voice again. And it was pretty scary, but I thought, this is really important, because it's the city, it's how it works. And the city ultimately is the machine by which we are all here. And if the city fails, then we're in trouble, because, you know, we are not all going to be able to do our businesses if we're unable to afford to live here. So anyway, I got a little bit of a voice, and I started to talk particularly about, I live in the north side, so I'd be in the Croke Park, and I'd be looking out at the horizon, and I was noticing Ballymun, for instance. And I have a bit of affection for the Ballymun Towers. I am unique in this. But my husband's from Ballymun, so I would look out from the stands and see these proud matrons of the landscape and think, geez, they're kind of odd, aren't they? They're distinctive. Like, you know, they're quite iconic. And just as they were voted one of the 100 most, in the top list of 10 most iconic structures in Dublin, they were demolished. But I had written to Doc-Imomo, who are the institute involved and vested in the protection of modern architecture, and I said, do you think we should knock them all down? Maybe we keep one as a gallery. Maybe we keep one as a nightclub. Like, you know, memory is lost as soon as the building is gone. Ballymun means nothing to a whole generation who never saw these brutalist pieces of architecture, and they were gone. And there was nobody said anything, and I was kind of like, oh, I really am alone in this. But then there was a small sea change. There's Emma Galeese, she talks a lot about architecture, and we started tweeting, and we started talking about AIB on Bagot Street, which was demolished. And then we started talking about the motor tax office, and they said, will you write an article on brutalism? Because I like brutalists. I like modern architecture as well. I like buildings that tell a story. I like the allegorical tale of architecture of the city, because it's not just it's about the moo cow came down the road. Ultimately, Joyce saw he was part of the dairy. There was a dairy on Constitution Hill. So anyway, with that, I thought, I'll write a little piece. I quite enjoyed it, and I enjoyed being able to talk about brutalism because there was quite a good response to it. Like, not everybody wants to knock all of modern Dublin down, and it is with no irony that we're here at the back of Hawkett's house, voted the ugliest building in Dublin, except for me and Neil Toner from the Irish Times, who both think that the fact that something can be voted so ugly means it has some value. Anyway, I went on and wrote a few other pieces about affordability in apartments and all that kind of stuff. And then I was annoying people, and they were saying things like, she has doubled down on stupidity, which was one of those moments you go, oh, I don't feel so good about myself. I really wish I hadn't read that one. But I also realised that there was like things like my 12-year-old daughter was going, you have to keep going, Mum. You just have to keep going. So I thought, okay, I'll just keep going until such point that somebody unplugs me. But I wrote about Tara Street across the way. And I said, because to my mind, now I'm a fan of architecture, and anybody who knows me knows that, but I didn't want it to overshadow the Customs House. And I thought, that's not a very good idea. It should be kept down the Docklands. And I wrote a piece, and they weren't fond of that piece at all. And there was quite a lot of talk about it. And the next thing, there was a few ads in the newspaper talking about Dublin, and they had all these images of skyscrapers. I don't know if any of you saw that. It was like, is this the limit of our imagination? You know, we can be like San Francisco or Chicago. And they listed off all these towers. And then I thought, and then they also talked about homelessness, that somehow wanting to conserve architecture made you not an advocate for housing. So, and then I thought, is conservation the reason why people don't have houses? Because it was that kind of argument that was going on. So I thought, okay, I'm going to face my demons here, and I'm going to do a bit of research. So I took the 4 skyscrapers, and I thought, right, I'm going to study each one of them and study their cities. So and particularly San Francisco, because I'd lived in San Francisco. And San Francisco was like this room. That was my memory of San Francisco. It was full of young people and full of innovation and full of life. San Francisco is a dystopian nightmare now. This city that we are supposed to love is full of people who can't afford to live in it. And so, likewise, there was problems in Chicago. Anywhere they were mentioning as these places that we should aspire to weren't very pleasant places for ordinary people to live in. That said, I was kind of offering up to do a bit of a study on this and write on this when I thought, what am I going to do? I'll have to have facts and figures. So I started to research properly. And in the research, I discovered that it is conservation at its moment is the only thing that protects the city from the kind of financialization of it, basically. Because, you have that moment of Ulysses where you have the dairy or you have the locksmith. The locksmith is a small footprint on a city street. So if you let 3 footprints decay, and then say a vested interest comes and they buy out the entire land and they put what is really a proliferation of student accommodation and co-living, and they're saying we're making so many units per square foot, but they're also locking out ordinary people from buying into the city to live and to work in. So that means your blocklayer, your painter, your locksmith can no longer access the city for business. So the city is closed for business for ordinary business people. And once it's closed for their business, it's only open for business for people who are buying entire blocks. So investors. So it's locking out a certain percentage of the population, to the point that in San Francisco, they are now grafting in to the city blue-collar workers. And I don't know any other phrase to do it, but basically they are taking people who would have lived in the city and having to bring them back in, because nobody can afford to travel into the city to work. And it's that key. So we are being told that this is the way we should live. But in the analysis, unless you tie in not just affordable housing, but affordable working places, unless you make it a place for painters, for upholsterers, you're guaranteeing kind of they call it displacement, but you know what I'm talking about. It's basically you need to be able to come in. You need to be able to come into a space like this to co-work at affordable prices. It's not just about living in the city. And Dublin, and I do want to say this on a high point in a way, because to a certain extent, we are ahead of the pack. We are not London, we are not San Francisco, and we are not Chicago. We are here now. So we are at a point where we can actively stop the end of the city of Dublin and sort of say, actually, this far and no further, or talk about it not in terms of height or conservation, but in terms of they're the phraseologies that are used, but to protect your lives within the city. And we're at that point where we can still do it, because the tipping point hasn't happened yet, because we are still having the active conversation. But it's like bees in a forest, until we protect if you look at the census between 2011, so you have to do this when you're talking to some of the economists, as this, they don't understand when you say, I just like it. And they don't respect you when you say, I just like it, or it's an intuitive feeling. And that was the awful thing. I realized that as a creative person, you will have an intuitive, strong instinct about something. And it's very hard to protect that without sometimes having to go to facts and figures. But there's an increase in artists in the city, but there's a radical drop in stonemasons and blocklayers. And there's a huge increase in office workers. So what we have to do is tie into our legislation the protection of people who perhaps work with their hands, tradespeople. And in that thing where they're telling us, we're going to trade off 20%, the way we're supposed to give 20% of our fantastic new apartment buildings to poor people, or affordable, as we would say. They don't want to do that. Instead, they're going to give you land somewhere else. That can't happen. That's where we have to hold the line and say, because that's what will cause the tipping point. That is what we'll call the movement back into a city that is on a run of affordability. So that's my very important message for today. And I don't know if I've run over in time or not. I'm okay. So, but bees in the city. That's what it is. It's about pollinating the city with affordability. And in that is the protection of the small footprint on the street. And it is why when they talk about student accommodation or they talk about co-living, yes, they're giving more units per square foot, but they're not giving leases, they're giving licenses, and they're taking chunks of the city street out. So it's about that thing of maintaining a decent footprint. So that's it. Thank you very much.